Good afternoon, everybody. So your challenge today is to stay awake in the post-lunch coma zone. And I'll try not to drawl and on for endless hours and say nothing and put you immediately to sleep. But I do have a couple things I want to share with you on this topic. I'm not well equipped to see into the future other than at the longest distance. And a wise man told me, he says, it's easiest to predict the longest future out. For example, I can predict with 100% certainty that in the distant future, I will be dead. I can't predict with any certainty when that will be, although I hope it is out in that distant future. So everything I say today, keep in mind it's against the backdrop of a prediction about the future, and I may or may not be very accurate. I also would say one of the things that should inform the discussion today is one of my favorite quotes, that those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. So we're going to take a small history lesson along the way as well. And one of these things makes this thing go forward here. Okay, I'm going to start looking a little bit from the consumer side of things. And then, as you might imagine, we're going to take a little look from the producer side of things. And then I'm going to try and bring it all home and leave you with something that might be a little bit thought-provoking. So that's my goal for today, and I'll leave some time for questions and answers, although it seemed like it was a scant field of questions earlier today, so I won't leave too much time. So here's some good news. This data, I don't know how well you can see this slide, but this slide is with data that was drawn from the National Coffee Association of the USA's annual coffee drinking trends study. And if you take a look at this, what this is to look at the percentage of the U.S. population that identifies themselves as coffee drinkers. And the first year on this slide is 1975, and just over 60% of the U.S. population identified themselves as coffee drinkers at that moment in time. And you can see the trend line down to 1995. We had about 45 or 47%, some number like that, of U.S. population identified them as coffee consumers, themselves as coffee consumers. So we lost a huge hunk of the population there in the U.S. During that time period. And then there's some good news sort of built into the back end of this if you look at the time from 1995. And I've sort of dropped in 2011 on the end there, in part because it's the most recent data that we had, and in part because it makes the slide look better because you got a better line going up there. But you can see that we came back pretty substantially. So in 2011, 58, almost 59% of the U.S. population identified themselves as coffee consumers. So there's a lot of information that's encapsulated in this very simple slide if you know some of the history of coffee. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go forward here. Here's another, because I am the executive director of the Specialty Coffee Association of America. Here's a slide that I like. So starting in 1999, the NCA broke their survey into different kinds of coffee consumers, and they asked people to identify themselves if they were gourmet coffee beverage drinkers. So this is the track from 2000. In 2000, just a little over 8% of the U.S. population identified themselves as drinkers of gourmet coffee beverages. And you can see the trend line so that by last year, a little over 25%, or a little over a quarter of the population, identified themselves as drinkers of gourmet coffee beverages in the United States. And that's a huge uptick. And one of the ways that coffee has succeeded in the U.S. over the last 15 years has been through the efforts of people in the specialty industry, from pioneers like Mr. Pete and Jerry Baldwin and Jim Reynolds and a whole host of other folks, and great companies like Starbucks that really put coffee out in a new way in front of the American consumer. And you can see the result of that in this trend line. Before we get too far along, we should talk a little bit about what this specialty coffee thing is. People ask us, this is the most frequently asked question I get, is what is specialty coffee? This is the definition that we've been using for a number of years now, a coffee that has no defects and has a distinctive character in the cup. which might seem like a fairly simple definition, but if you look next to it, that's the SCA's green classification system, and it's a nice picture of all the defects and colors. And so the concept here is that you have to have a green coffee or raw coffee product that is of specialty quality in order to keep making specialty coffee along down the line until we get to the place where the consumer consumes it. So that's been our outlook, and that's one outlook. This is the simple, easy to memorize. I'm sure all of you have this at your fingertips all day, every day when people ask you about specialty coffee. This is the SCAE's definition. And I won't read it to you because certainly we'll all go to sleep in that process. But basically what they suggest is that it's really dependent on the beverage, that specialty coffee is defined by the quality of the beverage that the consumer holds in their hand. And they say a few things around that. We got curious last year about what specialty coffee means to those consumers. So we started to ask around. We put together a series of focus groups, worked with a market research company, and we asked people to identify themselves as specialty or gourmet coffee users. And the basic concept was that they had to self-identify as frequent coffee users and as ardent coffee users, big fans of coffee. And then we got them in a room and we asked them questions. Not we, SCA, but this market research folks got them in a room with the two-way mirrors and the cameras and microphones and everything, and asked them a bunch of questions and got some information from them. And we did those focus groups in 2 cities in the West Coast, in Los Angeles and in Portland, Oregon, and got some very interesting information out of that. One of the things we learned was that in the end of the day, for consumers, a coffee experience was exactly that. It was an experience. It wasn't a cup of coffee. It wasn't a bag of roasted coffee. It ultimately was an experience of coffee, normally one that they shared with somebody else, and it could take place in their home or in a coffee house or at work, all kinds of places. But in all, it was an experience and not a product. One of the other things we learned, much to our chagrin, is that the word specialty is completely non-resonant with U.S. consumers. It's meaningless to them. They don't know what it is. They don't identify with it. They think it might be a marketing term, but in any event, they don't connect it with their coffee experiences. So one of our challenges this year really is to start a new round of research to understand how they do connect with their coffee experience. What are the words that they associate with positive coffee experiences? And how do they move through the coffee channels? Another thing we learned was that consumers have a highly emotional connection with their coffee. We were very surprised. You know, we think of coffee in the U.S. as a very utilitarian thing. It's something you do in the morning, you get a cup of coffee, and maybe something you do at a mid-morning break, and maybe something you do in the afternoon. But it's fairly pedestrian activity, you're having a cup of coffee. And it turns out consumers are much more emotionally engaged with coffee than we thought, particularly consumers who perceive themselves as users of high quality or gourmet or specialty coffee. They have a very intense emotional connection to the product. Oops, didn't want to go there yet. Sorry. One of the things we learned in this that sort of summed it all up was a sort of new perspective about consumers. And it turns out that there are a number of reasons that we drink coffee, and it should be obvious on the face of it that one of the reasons we drink coffee is for caffeine delivery. So, you know, you get up in the morning and you want that cup of coffee in part because you want caffeine to launch your day with. And all of us, whether the most ordinary consumer or the most sophisticated connoisseur of coffee, at one time or another occupy that space where we're looking for caffeine delivery. What we want is caffeine delivery. And we're less concerned about the quality of the experience. We're less concerned about the quality of the product. We want caffeine delivery. And we need to keep that thought in mind because we're always at risk from other products that can deliver caffeine, from energy drinks and colas and all kinds of products that are tea, other products out there. But we also learned that there's another space that many of us occupy. Sometimes we want to have coffee for a positive, warming experience It's a nice beverage. It's social in aspect. It's got a lot of positive associations for people. Sometimes we want to have a nice, solid coffee experience. We want to be in a nice place, talking to somebody that's interesting for us, having a good tasting cup of coffee. And sometimes, the high-end consumer wants to have an exceptional, memorable, highly emotive experience with coffee. And in that instance, it all has to come together. The ambiance has to be right, the company has to be right, the cup of coffee has to be exceptional, the service has to be exceptional. You know, it's that perfect moment, and we've all had them. We hear from people all the time. Costa Rica is a great example. People will come back from here and they'll say, oh, I had the best cup of coffee in Costa Rica, which is quite possible, but most of the time we listen a little longer and what we hear is, I was on the beach, it was the perfect relaxing weekend, my wife and I were celebrating our 10th anniversary, and we sat out on our little lanai and had a cup of coffee, and it was great. And that's an emotional association for that consumer who recognizes this specialty coffee experience. It has only something to do with the product. It has a lot to do with the situation, with the company, with the ambiance, with all the pieces coming together to make a memorable coffee experience. So why do I tell you all this? Well, let's go backwards a little bit. And let's take a look at this slide right here. So you guys are all coffee people. What happened in 1975? Something important in coffee. It got cold down south. Got very cold. We lost a lot of coffee. Price of coffee skyrocketed over the $3 range. And a funny thing happened. Coffee got more expensive, and roasters in the U.S., in an effort to not lose market share to price, took a whole variety of approaches to keeping price flat or only marginally increased. So they dramatically changed the inputs for their standard coffee blends. We got the introduction of the, at that time, 13-ounce pound. So, you know, a pound, an average pound is actually 16 ounces. That coffee can, that 1 pound can of coffee in the U.S. became a 13-ounce can that year. We got the introduction of something called flake grinding or high yield grinds, where we were designed to let the consumer reduce their cost per cup by having a higher yielding coffee, that is coffee that would dissolve more readily in water. All these things combined to drive the quality of the coffee experience downward. Oddly enough, at that same moment in time, consumption in the U.S. started to go down. And it kept going down for 20 years. Another thing that happened at that moment in time is that we lost a group of consumers. One of the things you want to know about coffee is that in order to make coffee consumers, you have to start them fairly early. In the U.S., 85% of all coffee drinkers started drinking coffee before they were 25 years old, and 96% of coffee consumers started drinking before they were 35 years old. If they weren't coffee drinkers by the time they were 35, they never became coffee drinkers. And in that period, we lost a critical piece of the end of the baby boomer generation and the beginning of the Gen Xers. Many of them never came back to coffee. They switched to diet sodas and sodas. Some of them probably drink energy drinks today. Some of them became tea drinkers. Some of them just never took up the caffeine habit, but we never got them back. I tell you this, again, in the spirit of studying history so we're not destined to repeat it. Let's roll forward a little bit and talk about things from the producer side of the coin. So, Mr. Neumann gave us an absolutely fact-filled presentation this morning about the likely future of coffee production and consumption. I'm going to show you just some very simplistic looks at this. I was very, very appreciative of his detailed look. But here's a sort of look at production versus consumption worldwide over the last 12 years. And these are from ICO data. But you can see that consumption has gradually overtaken production, and in general, the tendency is for a tightness of supply. And those of you who are producers in the room, hang on, I know that supplies are anything but tight today. But the general tendency, and remember this is a 12-year outlook, is for some relative tightness of supply. This slide looks at exportable coffee production. So these are coffee exports from 1992 through 2010. And the dark red bars there are the overall exports of natural Arabicas and Robustas. And the light pink bar represents the exports of washed Arabicas with Colombians and other milds. And if you look at that line, you can see in 1992, total exports of washed Arabica coffees were about 37 million bags. And by 2010, they'd gotten up to about 37 million bags. And in 2012, the year we just ended, Roberto just sent out the year-end look, and it was 35 million bags. So essentially, in the last 20 years or so, we have increased our total production by 35 million bags, or a little more, and 100% of the new production is in either Robustas or natural Arabicas. Now, this is one way, and I have in the past, I must admit, sort of used this as a proxy for quality going down. And I agree with Mr. Neumann. It's quite possible that overall quality has not actually gone down. It's quite possible that the sky is not falling, but that the earth is slowly rising. But in the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because what we're talking about is a baseline. So the sort of lowest acceptable level of quality where consumers will drink coffee, that baseline has risen. I think the production of natural Arabicas is substantially higher in quality than it was even 10 years ago. And I'm certain that there are serious advances in the quality of Robusta production. So the bottom of the pyramid, the low end, the minimum acceptable level of quality, that bar has risen somewhat, which is the good news. The bad news is price pressures have kept people out of the markets at the top end of the quality spectrum. And what I wanted to demonstrate to you with the consumer outlook is that the best way to engage consumers, keep them engaged, to build consumption, is to give them peak coffee experiences. Experiences that stay with them and that they want to repeat and that they engage in early in life and stay with for the rest of their lives. And we need to make sure that we can provide a scenario in which that happens. Now, the conventional wisdom in coffee is that coffee is a supply-driven marketplace. If there's lots of coffee out there, lots of coffee gets taken off at relatively low prices. If there's not very much coffee out there, not so much coffee gets taken off at relatively high prices. We've looked at increased demand as a sort of a linear trend that's associated with two things. One is an increase in population, and the other is with the emergence of more disposable income in certain economies. And that may well be true. And if it is in fact true, the big question becomes, how do we stimulate the production of washed Arabicas? And more importantly, what do we do with them when we got them? Because ultimately, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we deliver to consumers a more positive, engaging coffee experience, which includes better tasting coffee, which includes better service, which includes a better ambiance, which includes positive health news about coffee, which includes all these things that roll up into the consumer experience, then they consume more coffee. And if they consume more coffee early, they keep consuming more coffee for the rest of their lives. So here's my suggestion. We need to learn from our experience. In 1975 in the US, we watched these prices go up, and we watched quality decline. And again, no question that today's baseline of quality is higher than where that sunk to, and that's a good thing. That means we can keep engaging consumers. But we want to keep pushing them up the pyramid. We want to keep pushing them up to better and better coffee experiences so that they are more and more loyal coffee consumers. We want to not get in this place where we have to reverse losses for 15 or more years. And would suggest, and again, I'm here in front of you as the Specialty Coffee Association of America, but I would suggest that in Europe today, actually I suggested this in Europe, not to great applause, that the quality of coffee in general is not increasing. And specifically I was in Germany, and my memories of having coffee in Germany in the early 90s were that I could stumble upon a great cup of coffee in Germany on any corner. And my memories of having coffee in Germany over the last 5 years have been that it's quite a challenge to get a really great cup of coffee there. And, you know, traders in Germany who've been around a long time will talk about the old days when they were buying lots of Kenyas and lots of Colombians and lots of Wash Centrals, and today when there's a very active market in Robustas and further processed Robustas and Brazil Naturals. And again, I believe absolutely that the baseline of quality that those coffees represent has been on the rise, but I don't believe that we can be satisfied there. We have to keep pushing the quality of the experience up, and we can only do that if we push up the quality of the product, the quality of the service, and overall the quality of that coffee experience. So how do we do this? Increase value. You raise value by creating an environment in which people can enjoy that coffee, whether that environment's in your home, whether that environment's in a restaurant, whether that environment is at work, whether that environment is out in a coffee house. You've got to raise the possibility of having an increased value equation with that coffee. We've got to increase the absolute quality. You know, we had a nice period here where prices were quite favorable for the consumer, or for the producer. And one of the things that we hear a lot in that scenario is that high price is the enemy of quality. And it is to a degree. It makes reasonable sense for the farmer as a businessman to shift his focus from price to yield at some point. If prices are high enough, yield is a much better determinant of what your financial success is going to be. As the market softens, that desire to increase the price through differentiation and quality becomes an important factor again. I would suspect that we will see pressure from roasters, again, on producers, to return to some of the quality separations and some of the differentiating factors of quality that we saw when there was an abundant oversupply of coffee. And I think that's good for everybody here. I don't think we want to get too much invested in the quality premiums. It's tough to manage financially, it's tough to manage from a risk standpoint, and it's only part of the equation. But I think it's critical that we don't abandon that we continue to push quality upwards as we can. We need to preserve traditional coffee producers. One of the things that happens in scenarios like this, if we start to lose traditional coffee producers, is we start to lose little clusters of industry, because coffee is not just about having a coffee farm with some trees on it, as you all know. You've also got to have people to work on that farm. You've got to have people to pick that coffee. You've got to have facilities to process it. You've got to have milling. You've got to have finance. You've got to have transportation. You've got to have a port system. All those pieces come together to make an industry cluster that makes coffee possible. And as we lose traditional producers, we lose those industry clusters, and those losses are very, very hard to reverse. They're very hard to reverse. So we need to make sure that we preserve that. And then we need to invest in the future of all coffee, not just the future of washed Arabica. We need to be cognizant that the entry point for new consumers, particularly in emerging markets in Southeast Asia and the rest of Asia, is through things like 3-in-1, soluble coffees. If we can invest in the quality of those products, we raise the baseline and we raise the hunger and the desire and the ability to recognize better quality products as they become more entrenched coffee drinkers. And that's critical for us. I also think it's absolutely imperative that producers, traditional producers, continue to look at the possibilities for increasing domestic consumption. It's a complete winning scenario for the producer. You've got a ready home for your coffee, you've got good price support, you've increased demand, and you've got a whole country now that's in touch with what coffee means. So you start to have market insights that are not available to you if you only sell your product. If you also consume your product, there's real joy in that. And there's an understanding then of what the buyer or the consumer wants. So you don't have to depend, as I so often have been complained to by farmers, that we don't understand what you want because you're depending on us to tell you, and apparently we are poor communicators. But if you become a consumer of your own product, it's very easy to understand what the market wants. So this is my recipe for the future. My prediction is it's not going to be easy. Apart from how convoluted this whole concept gets, we are facing sort of structural problems that we don't know the answers to yet. There's no question, I think the last staunch denier of any kind of climate change who was living on the east coast of the United States has become convinced in the last 10 days that we're going to see more and more of these kinds of dramatic climate events. You guys have been down here for the last 10 years, have seen it happening, and there's never been a question in your mind that it's happening. And it brings with it not just uncertainty around what rainfall patterns will be like or what hurricane might sweep through there, but the onset of more and more intense funguses with Roya that's getting harder and harder to combat. Those are functions of small changes in moisture content and temperature here. When temperatures go up slightly, Broca breeds a lot faster. Tons and tons of pathogens are going to take advantage of these kinds of changes. And we're going to have to be focused as an industry to be prepared to mitigate the effects of climate change, to develop breeding programs that bring us quality coffees that can survive in new scenarios. It's going to take a tremendous amount of collaborative effort from institutional players, from market players, from producers, from roasters. And then finally, I would say this. For all the roasters in the room, my apologies. For the producers in the room, pressure the roaster. It's the roaster's turn. We spent the last 15 years trying to push for quality at the producer level, saying, here's how you can make it better. Here's how you can do it better. Here's how we can get the quality up. This is what we want for quality. And you need to push back, because roasters have to do a better job. Roasters have to differentiate their product. Roasters have to be unwilling to prostitute their product for short-term gain. Roasters have to be cognizant that this is a long game. We need to capture consumers when they're young with positive coffee experiences that include great quality, great ambiance, great service, great news about health, an overall positive experience, and keep them for life. And we need to keep renewing that with every new set of young consumers. We need to keep pushing them towards this beverage, which, by the way, is part of a healthy lifestyle, may actually be quite good for you, certainly is not damaging to you, and is just a lot of fun to enjoy with somebody. Thank you.